Welcome back to the In Chamber. I'm your host, Tom Schumann. When business people are asked about the biggest threat to their organizations at that time, or maybe their top concerns, the answers often vary. Workforce has certainly been a popular choice lately, but competition and other external factors certainly come into play. No matter the answer, however, there are at least two key factors that help determine whether a company is going to successfully deal with that challenge. One, I would say, is leadership. The second, more so than ever, is adapting to change. Or maybe the leadership is what is needed to help adapt to that change. But we'll get into those topics and more with today's guest. She has been an executive with Amazon, a lawyer, an entrepreneur. She has an award-winning book titled The Journey of Not Knowing: How 21st Century Leaders Can Chart a Course Where There Is None. And then she's talking to us today from the lovely state of Oregon. Julie Benezet, welcome to the In Chamber.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's start with Amazon a little bit. That name always draws a little attention. 20 years ago, you were involved in helping find the right real estate and the right locations for what we could safely say then was a growing startup. It's also safe to say it's grown up pretty well, but that's a whole nother story. Julie, talk about your experiences with Amazon at that time and some of the takeaways you had from that.
Well, it's hard to encapsulate except to say that when I arrived there in 1998, it was a gawky adolescent, very much untried. Wall Street still didn't believe it had a business model, and you had a bunch of ex-gens trying to prove them wrong. So it was a very hypercharged, aggressive environment that was out to try new things. So we lived change every hour of every day and thrived on it. And to say that it wasn't scary would be a lie. It was very scary, but it was also exhilarating, and it taught me a lot. But the thing that I needed to do, I was the first real estate executive, is to roll out the real estate globally to make that company run. It's a digital company, but the book's got to go through something. So my responsibility was to somehow code a company's business that didn't have a business plan or a strategy attached to it into bricks and mortar. So I was charged with going out and getting sites in the cover of darkness. So we lived in a cloak of secrecy. My first manager, my first boss, was the chief logistics officer who had been brought into Amazon from Walmart, and he had been their chief logistics officer there, and that brought the attention of a lot of the business world, because it said, okay, if this guy's coming here, something big is about to happen. And so that landed at our doorstep in my group, because we had to help him find a bunch of real estate in a company that at that time only had two very small, tacky distribution centers and an extremely fast-growing line of products going out, all of them books at this time. So that was my charge, to go get something, which meant that when I went out there, I had to travel with a fake name. It said, go to this area and find us something, and 500,000 square foot distribution centers are not just lying around.
And how fast would that occur? As you say, to go into one location to go in and then try and make something happen. What are we talking about? Have a place?
Well, maybe 3 months to get it all going.
Yeah.
You weren't given any time at all. The normal cycle to get something like that would have been closer to a year, but we weren't given that luxury. Bezos would say, it will be so, and it was made so. So we have to go out and find these things very, very fast. So we had to spend a lot of time making things up and talking to other people into leasing us space when they didn't know who we were. And if they knew who we were, we didn't have any credit rating because we were unprofitable, and Bezos would advertise to the Wall Street, would say, well, this profitability thing is kind of a bourgeois notion later.
It's
And
not it's
which
not like you had the shiny marketing brochure to carry with you to talk to tout the
no, it was very
company.
unshiny. It didn't exist. So we spent a lot of time basically doing our homework and getting the trust of people because we were putting them into uncomfortable places. And I think the biggest takeaway from Amazon was that in order to lead in the 21st century, you have to be comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing. And what you don't know is how it's going to come out because you're trying something new. And that is scary. But it very much goes with the territory. And what I learned was that actually was something that helped you do good work rather than something that was a deterrent, and to treat the scariness of the new as an asset, not as a liability.
Well, it sounds like something you've certainly built on over the last 20 years. But the one other question about Amazon, you mentioned this being your role at that time being a bit of a secretive process. That certainly wasn't the case in the last couple of years when we look at the Amazon's HQ2 process. Interesting to hear your perspective as someone who was there a couple of decades ago at the early stages. What did you think about that process and how it played out?
Well, I'm glad I wasn't in charge of it.
Congratulations.
Yeah, I sidestepped that one, and I by agreement, I did. The people who are leading the real estate now at Amazon are people I hired, but we have an agreement that I don't ask or they don't tell, and I didn't because it was inappropriate.
Sure.
Nevertheless, I did have opinions about it. What struck me was that it was an audacious move. Jeff Bezos, I think, invented BHAGs, the big, hairy, audacious goals, although
Hmm.
for him it's just normal. And in order to reach out and find a place to house 50,000 people, these things aren't just lying around. So my assumption was the key driver of it was going to be about talent. And finding 50,000 people who can work at that very competitive company is a challenge in any format. To say you want them all in one place is even a higher bar. So what struck me was, and the initiative was not led by real estate. It was led probably by Bezos himself, and that's a guess. But is they were looking at many parameters and putting it out to 200 different communities to ask them to say, go on, respond to this RFP. I don't think that was done frivolously, would be my guess, having worked with Bezos. He loves data, and he wanted to dig deep to see where the possibilities were. I will say that to have two headquarters, I was more struck by why would you want two when you can barely run one? It's a, for a place that's 20 years old, it's very scrappy. It's very independent. Bezos himself was a libertarian, and he doesn't like a lot of rules, although they've discovered rules. But headquarters are hard to manage, and as anybody who's worked in a regional office knows, you're always the stepchild. And when you have a second headquarter, I don't know what you call that. So I was more struck by the organizational issue than the strategy. The strategy of finding a place for more talent, because you can only go so deep into Seattle, that made sense. So when they broke it into two, I think that had more to do with the division of talent than.
Right. All right, Julie, let's switch gears. Let's talk about change then. You've already referenced what it was like 20 years ago and some of the lessons learned. If you look at change today, often I hear, kind of the reaction is, wow, there's a lot of change taking place. People are a bit overwhelmed. Do we need to kind of change the conversation to, and I'm sure this is a bit of what you're doing, here's how we cope with that change. Here's how we adapt and adjust.
Yeah, I think that the 21st century's gift was the internet, and it changed all the rules, which means it goes 24/7. Your competition is global, and you never know who can show up in real time to compete with you, and that has made everybody extremely nervous. There's also a huge amount of information flying around that, fake and otherwise, that you have to parse to figure out what to do. And I see day in and day out is people go into reactive mode. And with so much uncertainty, people are very fearful. And instead of going towards it and saying, oh boy, what are the possibilities here? They will pull back and run for cover and try to go back to old solutions that don't meet today's market. So the first thing I tell people is quit fighting it. It's here to stay. You can't go back to business as usual because there is no usual. And the sooner that you embrace that, the easier it's going to be for you. But that also means the second thing is you have to embrace the fear and see it as an asset rather than a liability, as I said earlier, and understand that if you're trying to figure out how to make something better, how to find something that's going to be successful for you, you're going to spend a lot of time looking into places you haven't been before, and to be okay with the nervousness that creates. Which goes on the next thing, which is to focus on something you can do to make things better. What is it that will help your organization move its game up and meet the needs of today's customer? So I tell people to pay attention to the stakeholders that you want to benefit and find out what is it that they want from you that you can provide. And then the fourth part is to be patient. This goes in increments. That everything is so speedy doesn't mean that you stop thinking. You just have to think harder and faster. But it's important to dig in and go to these places and say, when you have these questions, like what was working with that product we sent out and what didn't you like, is you're asking a lot of questions people don't want to answer. And yet you need the answers in order to adjust your product or come up with something new that's going to be successful for you and for them. And then finally, when you have your information, is you have to decide. And people they're having a very hard time making decisions these days because what if it's wrong? What if I fail? What happens if things collapse? And what you need to do is to look at it as an experiment. Says the cost of doing nothing is going to be greater than the cost of going forward and risking failure. So at some point, you have as much information as you can get. You'll never get it all, but you push yourself forward. And that is the mindset of the 21st century. It's an entrepreneurial mindset that a lot of people are learning to adjust to.
Julie, one of the points was about being patient, and I know you said that probably the biggest challenge is getting people to recognize that you can't go back to the way things are or were. But is there also an opposite problem? Once people do embrace that, okay, they realize we have to change, do they think they have to adjust at the pace that the change is going? Do they try to move too fast, or do you not see a lot of that?
Well, there is a lot of reactive behavior, and people get into silly places. You'll see them try change for the sake of change, and that's not good. It is just, okay, we set up this new property management division, and why don't we just add on to that some kind of scheduling software that we can create? And they don't know anything about it. They've never done it before. They don't know those customers, and they'll flail around, and they can spend a lot of the company's precious time and money on something that they're not going to become expert in doing. So there's this bias towards just trying to try something new because they think that's what they're supposed to do, and you still need to stop, and I say have a meeting with yourself. If you find yourself going at this breakneck speed and things are whizzing by you and nothing is quite landing with people, it's time to sit down and think about things.
Julie, I tied in leadership and adapting to change together in kind of introducing this. Do you find instances where people are very, very strong leaders in general, but they struggle with this change element of it? And if so, how do you try to get them to adapt, to utilize their natural leadership abilities to embrace this?
I think that it shows up. Yeah, I do. Short answer. So, a lot of people still have this image of a leader as having it all handled, and they like to be super confident. And if you're super confident, I think you're missing things. In the Great Recession, one of the things I saw, for example, among the real estate community was, and it's in tatters, everybody knows this, but you'd see these people who were running brokerage firms, for example, saying, yeah, no, it's everything's great. And it's not great. Everybody knew that. But what they felt they had to do was to put out the persona that they knew what to do and they knew what was going to happen. And the fact is, nobody had any idea what was going to happen. There's no form file for what happened in 2007 and 8. And the ones who were most successful were the ones who say, I don't know how this is going to come out. I don't know what we're going to do long term. What I do know is that the first steps we're going to take, and I need your help to do it. And those were the people that were the leaders who were most successful. And that ability to reach out in a humble way and say, let's work together on this. This is what I know. This is what I don't know. Because the journey of not knowing is learning what you need to know to go forward and then move forward an inch at a time. But start by admitting that you don't have it all under control. And the leaders who really flail with that are the ones who don't like to look vulnerable. They don't want to look like they're underprepared or not on top of things. And they're the ones who end up the most stressed because you can only sustain that for so long.
I mentioned the title of your book earlier, The Journey of Not Knowing. You also have a complement to that, the Journal, AL at the end, of Not Knowing. Talk about that a little bit. It sounds like that's a bit of a self-discovery type exercise. Talk about the importance of that in adapting to change.
Well, the rude notion of leading change is you have to start with yourself. Self-knowledge is power. And it's interesting. I have been an executive coach for 17 years. I was an executive, and I thought since I lived that life, it's the life I know. Why don't I help other people do it? So I spent many years doing that. And what I found was that the last thing people ever had a chance to do was to think about themselves. They're too busy doing their job than to think about it and to go into that place of why is it that I can't bring myself to to lay off this person who's no longer performing? Why is it am I getting stuck with my inability to close down this division that has not been performing? Why is it that I'm not trying to reach out to this other company that could be a great partner? And it goes down to things like they're nervous. They have fear of failure. They may be perfectionistic and say, if I don't get everything buttoned up in a line and know how it's going to happen here, I'm going to fail. And it goes back to having parents who were very high achieving and had no tolerance for failure. And a leader needs to go back and look at those origins and figure out where in their life that had an influence and how that bring that forward and how in their current life they can change that the things that get them stuck now could be old stuff. It could be new stuff as well. But the self-guided tour is to sit back and say, okay, what is it I want to do? What is it that I am afraid of? And what is my relationship with risk? Because we all have to take risks and accept that we may not like it, but we need to know how we respond to it. And then how do we get in our own way? Do we get perfectionistic? Do we start micromanaging? Do we avoid conflicts? These are what I call hooks. These are defensive behaviors that help quell the nervousness, but they get in the way of these bigger things that you're trying to achieve. And then ultimately, what's the fuel that makes me go? And so the journal offers the opportunity to apply the principles of the journey, which are, what are those things that you want to do? What is it that could get in your way? And what is going to allow you to get through the whole thing?
Julie, you mentioned risk in general. Do you think leaders are more willing to take risk today, or was that the case 20 years ago, where they might have been more willing to to go out and take different risks?
It's a great question. I have no data to support this, but I will say the millennials are quite interesting because they live in a vast social media and they're exposed to new all the time. They take a lot of risks because they came into a world where what they saw were new things every second of every day, and I think they do it more naturally. The older generations, I think, are more conservative about it. They spend more time holding back. At Amazon, the reason that we could take the risk we did was we had a very risk-taking CEO that created that culture, and it was very much sort of an environment you wanted to please Jeff, that you wanted to show him how inventive you could be, and that has its positives and negatives. But what it did was it empowered people to do those things. So in today's world, the places where people are willing to take risk and show that the other people that's the way to go are going to do better. I think normally people don't like a lot of change. They like things the way they are. They want it regular, and because otherwise they have to spend a lot of time and vigilance coping with changing themselves, and that's what change does. Change makes you change, and change is painful. So I don't think that has changed in itself. I think what has changed is the necessity for it, and the pressure of when you won't do it. You know you're not doing it, but I'm not sure you don't. It makes you more risk-taking.
Julie, I imagine as you're working with leaders, whether individually, as a group in general, you probably get the question, what type of change have you dealt with? So I'll put it this way. Well, what's maybe the scariest or most intimidating type of change that you've dealt with in your career?
Well, it's going to sound stupid in the context I'm talking about these broad sweeps of the internet and global environment and all the things that in the world that change constantly. But for me, it was leaving a large law firm where I was a lawyer a year before making partner to go into a real estate development firm. And at that time, this is in the 80s, leaving the law, not being a lawyer, was a big deal. You just did not do that.
That sounds pretty significant to me to make that change. Yeah.
Does it?
Yeah.
Well, it was to me. And here was the brass ring. I was a year from partner, and I was on track, and I was in the second biggest law firm in Seattle, so a pretty nice career, worked hard, but it had it had a pathway that I could see, and I knew how it could turn out. But I was restless. When I would work with a company to capitalize it, when we were finished with the deal, I want to walk out the door with them to go do it. So I realized that rather than spend my time advising people on the risk of a deal, I wanted to take the risk and be that decision maker. So when I was 7 months pregnant, I was offered a job to go be the legal counsel and a manager in charge of raising capital for a large real estate development firm in Seattle. And I really struggled with it. It wasn't that I was pregnant. Somehow that was not the reason. It was, oh gosh, I am leaving a gold-plated career here that I worked hard to get.
Well, you had made a big investment to that point, not only in money, but time and career into establishing a law career.
Yeah, totally. But I will say that when I finally decided that, how did I really spend my weekends? I drove around to construction sites and watched them work. And I loved architecture design, and I love urban development. And I realized that's where my passion was. So I finally said, okay, I'll do this. And I did. I have no regrets. But I will say for years afterward, and it actually formed my later business, I would have at least at a month interval, have somebody call me up and say, can you go out to coffee with me and tell me how you did it? And it was leave the law and go into business. People just thought that was incredibly radical.
Julie, we've been talking about this adapting to change primarily in the concept of in the workplace and in the business world. How different is it if we were talking about personal situations, people in their lives outside of work? Are there a lot of parallels, or are there some different factors depending whether we're talking work or family life, home life?
It's really no different. It's in the journey I talk about with the core four, and the first ingredient of the core four is to have a dream. And your dream could be something is that you want to be a community organizer, and because you believe in some kind of issue that's going on in your town. And in order to do that, you have to, on top of your day job, is to spend evenings going out to groups and campaigning for something, and it will affect your family. So what you have to do is to be able to negotiate with your family as to what that the impact would be, because you don't know how it's going to come out, and then make sure. And then you're doing something, of course, that's new, because if you've not been a community organizer before, you're not going to know how to do it, and so that's got its own scariness. And then but you have to figure out ultimately why you want to do that. What is going to help you. You had maybe a cousin who you totally admired, and you would love to be like that person, and their support of you is really key in it. So you look to them for motivation to go out and do this scary thing. It could be if you decide to put together a wellness program for yourself, and that requires going to the gym after work instead of coming straight home, and could change how matters are handled at the home front. And that itself is an important dream. And the risk is your family won't like it, so you have to negotiate that. And then you have to make sure that you get to the gym, and then know why it is that you want this wellness program. Well, it could be you saw a revered uncle pass away because he was not healthy, and you want to live to a ripe old age so you can see your children go out and enter the world. So that behooves you to be healthy. So it applies both personal and professional life. It's just about having dreams, handling the risks, and getting past them in order to the place that you can achieve something new.
Well, Julie, we've heard you talk about experiences at Seattle. As I mentioned, you're based in Oregon now, so the West Coast. I'm sure you work with clients all over the country. Any Indiana experiences in your background? Have you been to the Hoosier State? Other than appearing on this In-Chamber podcast, any Indiana ties you can point to?
Well, I will say my favorite aunt and uncle lived in your town. So I always had a good impression of Indianapolis. But my father loved Evansville, Indiana, more than any place in the world, and he lived there when he was a boy. What I didn't know was why he was there and what his family did. But I ended up 4 years ago doing a lot of work with Meade Johnson, which is in Evansville.
Mm-hmm.
And it gave me a reason to travel to Evansville several times during that year. And the driver who would take us over to Meade Johnson was really fascinated. He was an Evansville native, and he was really fascinated with my grandfather. He said, "What did he do here? Where did they live?" I said, "I don't know. Nobody ever told me, and nobody's around to give me the information." So he took it on himself to go to the library and talk to the historian there. And the first thing that she did was pull out this book that my grandfather wrote called 100 Years, a real bestseller, 100 Years in Evansville, Indiana. And then the second thing she pulled out was the address of my grandfather's place. And the third thing she pulled out is the story of his job, and he was the superintendent of schools. And I said, okay.
All the pieces coming together there, yeah.
Yeah, they were. And then when I went to work in Meade Johnson, they were just ecstatic. They had roots in their town. And it allowed me, spending time there, to find out why it is people love that town. So I have a good impression of Hoosier State, that it is amazing at Meade Johnson. You have people from all over the world, the scientists, the doctors, and so on, who work on putting out infant milk is they come to Evansville, which is so different from where they come from, and they don't want to leave. They want to stay there. So I have a wonderful impression of Evansville or my grandmother.
Yeah, we find that in various parts of Indiana, whether it's here, Indianapolis, central Indiana, but certainly other regions of the state. Once people come and experience that Hoosier hospitality and everything that goes along with it, they do typically want to stay. It's that initial attraction that is sometimes the challenge when you talk to people maybe from the coast and you talk about Indiana. It's like, are you talking Illinois, Iowa, Indiana? Kind of mix up all those states a little bit. But we're glad that you got that impression, and obviously your family had a great experience in Evansville. Julie, what are some things I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a groundedness about Indiana that is very attractive. We talked about change and what that's all about, and at the end of the day, you have to want to be grounded by human beings. And I think that the state of Indiana has this wonderful, solid sense of people who know who they are, what their values are, and what they care about. And that's a very powerful thing.
Now, that does come into play, certainly. We appreciate that. Julie, what are some things you like to do in your spare time when you're not working?
Well, I love to roam compelling places, whether it's out in nature or cities. I used to be a bond lawyer, and I would go to these other towns to do deals, but I would spend lunch hours walking around looking at the architecture. I'm a gardener. I love to visit new wineries. I live in Southern Oregon, which is a wine region, so I love to see what they're up to. And I also love jazz. There's no good moment of the day that a good jazz piece doesn't improve.
Excellent combination. Last question I want to ask that we're posed to all of our guests this year, and again, it ties in a bit with certainly the leadership element. But when you think about either personally or professionally, when you think of the topic of success, what does success mean to you?
Me personally?
Yeah. What does success mean?
Success is when I feel like I've done something to make things better. I've always wanted things to be better. As a kid, I'd sit around in a tree house that I had built, and I'd look out across the neighborhood and say, how can I make this tree house better? And I lived in Colorado Springs, which was a boom town, and I loved the idea that people were going to come to this town and make it better. And in my professional life, I was in professional services quite a bit. I was an executive, whatever it was. Any time that somebody says, I did something different and I feel better, I feel great, because that's what we're here to do, is to improve others. So if I can make a difference by making things better, that's success.
Excellent. Julie Benezet, thank you so much for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate it. All right. Thank you.
All right. And you can learn more about Julie and her work at Julie Benezet. That's BENEZET.com. One reminder before we go, again, we've talked about leadership, adapting to change. Companies that have demonstrated that are part of the annual Best Places to Work in Indiana program. Applications are open for 2020. The program is in its 15th year, provides valuable feedback to all participants on workplace culture, strengths, as well as areas for improvement. November 15th is the application deadline for that, and details are at bestplacesToWorkIN.com. Thank you, as always, for listening to the In Chamber.